Hello, and welcome to Show Me History. I'm your host, Amy Blankenship. Picture it 1804, and St. Louis now belongs to a relatively new country, the United States of America. Up until this point, the village had autonomy over all aspects of life. While governed under the French and Spanish in its infancy, neither government were hands on in enforcing their own laws, and St. Louis was self governed. St. Louisans were used to a way of life, a French Creole life based in Catholicism, French customs, peaceful relationships with local Native Americans, and as some would call it, a utopian society. The settlement was steeped in French ways of life, the way they built their houses, the layout of town, even their farming methods and field allotment were reminiscent of medieval European villages. The majority of St. Louisans were rather well off from the fur trading business and other industries, and were accustomed to a certain way of life. This was all about to change. Enter Thomas Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase. In a somewhat complicated transaction, the ownership of the land St. Louis occupied changed hands from the Spanish to the French to the Americans practically overnight. In 1802, Spain was in control of the majority of the lands west of the Mississippi River. However, the Spanish government felt that this land was not profitable and wanted to get rid of it. They secretly ceded the land to France on the condition that if France ever sold it, Spain would have first claims. The leader of France at the time, Napoleon Bonaparte, was eager to expand his empire and took Spain up on the deal. Things for Napoleon didn't quite go as planned. He was in a war with Great Britain and was trying to stop a rebellion in Haiti. At this point, he now needed money more than he needed land. So in 1803, he sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States. This now placed St. Louis under American control. The transition from a prosperous French village to a city under American control was not an easy one. And I believe this was partly due to the fact that the Americans kind of had an attitude about the Western Front at this point in time. They did not know much about the area, and they assumed it was backwoods, unsophisticated, and illiterate territory. St. Louis was, in fact, a very rich city dominated by a powerful group of elite families. The rich merchants had an opulent lifestyle of fine wines, coaches, silver, and fancy carriages. They wore fashionable clothing, had elegantly furnished houses, owned personal libraries, sent their children to elite schools in Europe, and had the finest goods imported from all over the world. It was a far cry from the frontier town imagined. St. Louis had its own defined culture, legal system, social norms, and successful relationship with local Native American tribes. Perhaps this was not something that the American government considered when establishing control over the area. This is pretty evident when the first American commander in St. Louis was appointed. Amos Stoddard was shocked to learn that St. Louis was a civilized, cultured, wealthy town that rivaled cities on the East Coast. Stoddard met with local officials of the town, including August Choteau and Charles Gratiot. Choteau and Gratiot represented the citizens and brought concerns to Stoddard. They were worried about the U.S. government not recognizing land grants from a foreign government. They were worried about slave ownership and trade and the continuance of their fur trading business. And they're also worried about the new American government being respectful of the relationships they had established with the Native American tribes. Stoddard's appointment was only temporary until more permanent arrangements were made. His main job was to pacify the citizens of St. Louis and assure them that the transition to the new government would go smoothly. The U.S. government split the Louisiana Territory into two areas at the 33rd parallel, Upper and Lower Louisiana. St. Louis was in the upper portion. This was further divided into subdistricts of St. Charles, St. Louis, St. Genevieve, Cape Girardeau, and New Madrid. The same act that divided the territory also outlawed foreign slave trade, authorized settlement of new Americans in the area, and nullified Spanish land grants after October 1st, 1800. Basically, everything that Stoddard had promised would not happen, happened. In 1804, the governor of the Indiana Territory, William Henry Harrison, and 3 judges arrived in St. Louis. They established a set of laws and local appointments. To appease local St. Louisans, he appointed Charles Gratchett as presiding judge. August Shoto, Jacques Clay-Morgan, David Delaney, and James McKay were appointed justices of the Quarter Court Sessions. A gentleman from Virginia named Samuel Hammond was given the post of civil commandment, and Edward Hempstan, a lawyer from Connecticut, was to be the attorney general. The newly appointed men and delegates from all areas of the Upper and Lower Louisiana Territory met in September of 1805. Charles Gratchett presided over the meeting to create a petition to Congress in response to the recent actions of the American government. These men felt that the Louisiana Treaty had been violated. There were no provisions for self-government, no protection for slavery. It created problems with Native Americans, and their land claims were now invalid. Governor Harrison wrote to Congress in favor of the petition. Congress saw this as a two-part territorial status issue. The first part being that the status given to the territory dictated the type of government and enforcement of policy. And two, they believed that the French Creoles of St. Louis did not understand the principles of being a republic and therefore should only have the rights and liberties they had while under Spanish rule. As a result, Congress established the territory at the lowest grade. A resident governor would be appointed by the president and serve for 3 years. This person was also in charge of military and indigenous affairs. A territorial secretary would record proceedings and report to Congress. 3 judges would be appointed and make up the Superior Court. The governor and territorial legislator would establish courts and enact laws. Criminal cases would now be trial by jury. As feared by St. Louisans, most aspects of their life were threatened or entirely changed under possession of America. From the treatment of the commons to the legal system to the affairs with Native Americans, life for them would not be the same. Thomas Jefferson envisioned an empire of liberty across the West for all people. Well, all people except for Native Americans. His plan was to move or eradicate tribes and encourage American settlement on land previously owned by them. In his second inaugural speech, Jefferson asked a question of his constituents. Is it not better the opposite bank of the Mississippi should be settled by our own brethren and children than by strangers of another family? In this question statement, he is referring to Native Americans. Jefferson targeted St. Louis in this problem. He disapproved of the relationship between Auguste and Pierre Chouteau and the local Osage tribe. Fur trade in St. Louis was forced to deal with whites only. The Osage were informed they were no longer protected by the Chouteaus and all trade was suspended. They were forced to sign a treaty of disposition. Land owned by the Osage tribe was now the property of the United States. This included land in half of Arkansas and most of Missouri. The U.S. government forced the Osage to live and trade only at Fort Osage under the watchful eye of U.S. soldiers. Fort Osage is located in present-day Jackson County near Kansas City, Missouri. Auguste and Pierre Chouteau tried to mediate on behalf of the Osage, but were not successful. Instead, they were met with a barrage of questions from Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. President Jefferson had sent these men to observe St. Louis, take notes, and report back to him. They questioned the Chouteau brothers on all aspects of Osage life, culture, and their role in the fur trading industry. They were questioned so much that Auguste Chouteau authored an essay entitled Narrative of the Settlement of St. Louis. All of this information would not be helpful to the U.S. government and in fact would be used against the Osage and in favor of relocating them out of the region. Pierre Chouteau was forced to assist the U.S. government with the relocation of the Osage since he knew their language and had established relationships with them and was very familiar with their customs and way of life. The banning of trade with the Osage potentially influenced the fur trading industry and the economy of St. Louis. However, the economy did manage to flourish with being forced to trade with whites only. The Chouteau family would be used repeatedly for negotiations with Native Americans. As a result, they were actually accepted into American society. Pierre Chouteau and his oldest son actually joined William Clark in a business venture, creating the Missouri Fur Company in 1809. Another part of life that would change for St. Louisans was a bit more local. It was in their backyard. American control of St. Louis changed the concept of the common lands. Prior to American control, the land was not considered public or private. It was owned as a whole by the community without government involvement. Some portions of the commons were assigned to individual citizens to cultivate and farm, but only during the growing and harvest seasons. The remainder of the year, the land was free for the entire community to use. This became quite an issue when American government took control. This type of land ownership did not exist in the American legal system. Everything was really black and white. Land was either owned by private individuals or owned by the government. There was no concept of communal land shared in ownership by the people as a whole. An 1806 statute recognized individual land ownership of the commons if the owner could prove they had been farming the land since 1800 or earlier. This resulted in an odd situation of residents owning long, narrow strips of land amongst government-owned property. As the city used the land to build public dwellings such as schools and government buildings, most landowners ceded, gave up, and sold their property to the city. The government owned the land and would use it as it saw fit for the good of all. The commons, as known by St. Louisans, would cease to exist. By 1850, the traditional view of the commons had vanished. The community owned no land for itself. One area of the old commons is actually still in existence. Today's Lafayette Park contains what was left of the commons. In an acquisition in 1836, the land became property of the city of St. Louis and would eventually become a park. The legal system was another area of profound change during this period. In colonial St. Louis, the most important aspects of life were governed by unwritten laws, social norms. They performed the same task of our current-day legal system: settled disputes, allocated property, and provided standards for private transactions. This laissez-faire type of legal system frustrated the newly appointed American officials. According to them, law without formal rules from a government seemed like no law at all. The St. Louis area had autonomy partially because it was too far away from New Orleans in Spain to properly govern and control, and partially because Spain did not want to exert effort on a territory that it saw as unprofitable. Any actual written law at this time came from the territory's lieutenant governor and local representatives. The Spanish did create a code of laws for its colonies in 1681, but most towns under Spanish control did not have an official copy to refer to, and most people didn't even know that it existed. There was quite a bit of litigation in the colonial area of the Louisiana Territory, and there did exist an informal system to manage it. Some situations that it took care of were debt settlement, commercial matters, property disputes, selling of goods and supplies, slander and victims of gossip, and employee-employer relations. The French/Spanish post along the Mississippi River were divided into districts, and one resident from each district was appointed to be captain. The captain was authorized to settle disputes in any legal matter that may arise. No formal laws were referenced or adhered to. Instead, these captains would rely on local customs, culture, residents, and the standard business practices of the area. They solved disagreements using an intuitive sense of justice. If a case could not be solved in this way, it was then referred to arbitrators. These would be members of the local community chosen by the litigants. Within a decade of possession, the legal system of St. Louis would change to mirror that of any major city east of the Mississippi River. The American officials in St. Louis and throughout the Louisiana Territory established subdistricts in the areas of St. Charles, St. Louis, St. Genevieve, Cape Girardeau, and New Madrid. Each of these districts would have the office of sheriff and clerk. They would also put into place laws to govern and institute courts and create the office of commandant. The main source of conflict between American and French Creoles, when law was concerned, is the view on how laws are created. The French Creoles viewed the law as something that originates from the people, their culture, and their traditions. The Americans believed law should be handed down to the people by the government. The law should be created by an appropriate governing body that is suitable and capable of enforcement. Well, it's a good thing that the Americans established this new legal system because the territory was going to need it. Once they became an official territory of America, population grew quite rapidly, and inadvertently, the wealth and reputation of St. Louis encouraged settlement by aggressive Americans. New waves of American migration brought about a behavior that was not previously seen in St. Louis. For the most part, crime rate was low, and other than one Native American killing another on the outskirts of town, there had not been a murder in the entire existence of the town. In general, life under Spanish rule had been rather peaceful. The Americans were a rowdy bunch that were prone to violent fights and attacked fellow citizens. It has been noted among contemporaries of the time that the Americans had deplorable public behavior. However resistant the French Creoles may have been to the invasion of American settlers, it did create quite a population growth. On November 27, 1809, St. Louis was officially incorporated as a town. They created a board of trustees consisting of August Shoto, William Carlane, Jean Cabanne, William Christie, and Edward Hampstead. The town expanded past its original grid and added another 6 miles of riverfront land. To enforce ordinances and maintain order among citizens, the board formed an armed patrol. A rotation of 4 men would serve, without pay, to patrol and protect the town. All men 18 or older were subject to patrol duty. The only exception were paupers, invalids, and preachers. The men would be rotated each day, and it would be almost 10 years before the first paid police captain would be appointed. In 1818, Mackie Worry would make $400 a year as the captain of the police department. In 1810, an ordinance enrolled all male citizens into 2 volunteer fire companies. Pierre Didier was the first captain. This ordinance also required all buildings to have at least 2 spare buckets and have chimneys cleaned once a month. The fire chief was given authority to enforce this portion of the ordinance and inflict fines when necessary. All of the changes imposed on St. Louis and its surrounding areas was in preparation for statehood. This too would not be an easy journey. On June 4th, 1812, President James Madison established the Missouri Territory as a second-class territory. This act distinguished boundaries for Missouri and created the Missouri Territory itself. All existing districts within the territory were now considered counties. All tax-paying white male citizens were given the right to vote for congressional delegates and for members of territorial government. The upper house of this government would serve as the legislative council and consisted of 9 members appointed by the president. The lower house would have 14 members elected by the people. All members were required to be a property owner, and delegates for the lower house were based on population of the districts. So St. Louis had 4 delegates, St. Genevieve 3, and St. Charles, Cape Girardeau, and New Madrid would each have 2 delegates. Having reached the population threshold of 60,000 inhabitants, the delegates sought admittance to the Union as a state. I'd like to point out that this number includes free whites and enslaved people, but not Native Americans, and this will play a role a little bit later in the story. Several petitions from the territorial government were submitted to the U.S. Congress requesting statehood. The petition submitted on December 12, 1818, would be the one to finally reach the floor of the House of Representatives. The admission of Missouri as a state was expected to be a routine affair. In February of 1819, a Missouri statehood bill was opened for debate on the House floor. James Talmadge, a representative from New York, threw a wrench in the works by suggesting an amendment. He suggested that Missouri should become a state, quote, provided that further introduction of slavery or involuntary servitude be prohibited, except for punishment of crimes, where the party shall have been fully convicted, and that all children within the said state after admission thereof into the Union shall be free at the age of 25. End quote. The debate would continue for the next 2 years. The Missouri bill with Talmadge's amendment would be a stalemate. It caused party fractions. Northern Republicans joined forces with the Federalists, while Southern Republicans united in opposition. It would become a matter of North versus South, a constitutional conflict, the seeds for the Civil War. So, why was it such a big deal to let Missouri become a state? This was the first real challenge to slavery in its expansion. Although Missouri was not the first state to be admitted to the Union west of the Mississippi River, allowing it to enter the Union as a slave state would set precedents, as other states were to be carved out of Louisiana Territory. When Alabama was admitted as a slave state, it created a balance of slave and free states in the country. Missouri would throw off that balance. Southern states questioned if the government had the right to dictate rules of slavery in the first place. Doing so would threaten their life and livelihood, whether through slave trade or use on plantations. The South was a slave-based economy. The northern states cited the Declaration of Independence as a source of being against the expansion of slavery. It renounced the document's universal application and its declaration that all men are created equal. The Federal Ratio Clause of the Constitution also became a factor in this argument. The clause states that 3/5 of slave population should be numerically added to the free population for a total population number for the state or territory. This number was used to determine congressional districts, electoral college delegates, and number of representatives in the U.S. House of Representatives. Without slaves, the southern states would lose a substantial amount of their population and representation. The Federalists and Northern Republicans debated whether this should be permitted going forward. The admittance of Missouri as a state had become quite complicated. Luckily, in January of 1820, a bill was introduced to admit Maine as a free state. The Missouri Bill and the Maine Bill became linked. A second amendment was added to the Missouri Bill to exclude slavery from the Louisiana Territory north of the 36.5 parallel, except within the limits of Missouri. The Senate vote on the bill was 24 to 20 in favor. The House vote was 90 to 87 in favor. It was officially signed by James Monroe on March 6, 1820. I know you history buffs are thinking, that's not when we became a state. And you're right, we're getting there. The final version of the bill admitted Maine as a free state and enabled Missouri to establish a constitution and a state government. So on June 12, 1820, the Missouri Constitutional Convention began at Mansion House Hotel in St. Louis. A total of 41 delegates, led by David Barton and Edward Bates, would develop the state's constitution. It contained the standard provisions for checks and balances, separation of powers, judicial review, and a representation system. On July 19, 1820, the Constitution was adopted by the convention, and they selected St. Charles as the state's temporary capital. Provisions of the law stated that the capital would be on a city yet to be built on the Missouri River near the mouth of the Osage River. In 1826, the capital would be moved to Jefferson City. Finally, on August 10, 1821, Missouri became a state. A little over a year later, in December of 1822, St. Louis was incorporated as a city. During this time, the city expanded its land area by 50 blocks. In April of 1823, the city elected its first mayor, William Carr Lane, and established a board of 9 aldermen. Mayor Lane paved streets, built a wharf along the riverfront, and established a board of health. During this time, St. Louis became more Americanized and started to shed signs of its French heritage. The streets were officially renamed as the mayor replaced the old French names. Streets running east and west were named after trees. Some of the familiar names St. Louisans might recognize are chestnut, olive, locust, and vine. North and south streets were assigned numbers. New types of homes were being constructed. Brick and stone were used in construction. Gone were the days of the French hip roofs and galleries on houses. The signs for storefronts were now in English. The days of French Colonial St. Louis were a thing of the past. During this time of change, St. Louis was fundamentally changed by its emergence as a state through American politics, by its place at the intersection of the question of slavery and westward expansion. In the 19th century, St. Louis saw the diversification of the region from an intercultural town to a city in the new border state. Thank you for joining me today. You can find me at our website. It's showmehistorystl.com. On Twitter, it's Show Me History. And then on Facebook, it's Show Me History STL. Until next time, I'll see you in the loo.